Welcome, Joe, and thank you very much for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea, and welcome everybody to this conference. Yes, as you said, thank you so much for the opportunity and to share some thoughts with you in terms of think tanks and partnerships. As Andrea mentioned, I have had the opportunity to straddle both the think tank space as well as in the funder space. And so some of the ideas I'll be sharing with you today is more about my personal experiences in these spaces. And before I begin the talk, I just wanted to share this infographic, which I am sure many of you or all of you probably have seen it somewhere at some point. So 1 second. Right. Okay. All right. So I'll get to it and then share my screen. I think the technology is not cooperating now, but I'll share it at some point. But I titled this talk, Further Together, Fostering Effective Partnerships for Sustainable Change. And I settled on this topic for a number of reasons. I'll get to it very shortly. But then I'll just begin by saying that this is really an honor and privilege to be here today, and more so to talk to all of you on a topic that is very near and dear to me. I do not know how or why I came to develop a passion for this topic, a topic that has more questions than answers, as we all know. But since think tanks excel in tackling difficult questions, I cannot imagine a better place to discuss this topic but here. I'm very confident that some of the vexing questions that I myself in both my research as well as in the world of philanthropy has faced and has never had the opportunity to get any good answers to them. I'm hoping that throughout this conference and in subsequent sessions, we'll begin to tackle some of those challenging questions. I would also like to thank the organizers and my good friends at On Think Tank for inviting me. It has been a great opportunity to work with On Think Tanks in several positions, and now engaging with you at this conference, which is of course my first time attending this conference, even though I've known about it for many years. Let me also acknowledge and thank my colleagues at the Afrobarometer. As Andrea has mentioned, Afrobarometer, as many of you may know, is a Pan-African survey research network that operates in about 30 countries across the African continent. And it is through this work that I've come to learn a lot about partnerships. And so some of the experiences that I will share with you today is also reflective of some of the experience I've had working on the Afrobarometer prior to going to grad school and also returning to work with them as the CEO of the institution. So when the conference organizers reached out to me a couple of weeks or months ago to ask if I would deliver this speech, I hesitated a bit. And my hesitation was, I thought keynote addresses are delivered by high-profile, very smart people. But then I know that I don't belong to any of that category. But when I read about the conference theme, which was on partnerships and collaborations, I think I was immediately sold. And why is that? Because in my previous professional life, both in private philanthropy and also in research, nurturing partnerships among institutions, grantee organizations, which includes think tanks or international NGOs, civil society groups, was very high on my agenda. And I was very deliberate in making sure that I used the tools that were available to me to try to foster some partnerships and ensure that collectively we're able to work together to achieve the outcome that we all set ourselves out for. I'm therefore delighted for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you, and hopefully some of it will form a food for thought as we go on to discuss and deliberate on the key issues as we go forward. Of course, when you talk of partnerships in the think tank world, this can take many forms, and a talk on this can proceed in numerous directions. I know that some of the subsequent sessions will do a deeper dive into specific partnerships. My aim for this topic, this talk, is just to zoom out a bit and discuss some of the overarching issues or characteristics about partnerships that we should be aware of, And my hope is that participants will hold some of the ideas that I'm going to share here at the back of your minds as you begin to engage in and do the deep dives. So starting with partnerships, I know Andrea has outlined 3 key questions that they hope to address at this conference. The first one being, why partnerships? Okay, so this sometimes may be one of the easiest questions to answer, because you don't need to do a lot of thinking to see the value that collaboration or partnerships can bring to the work that we do. A very familiar proverb, and I'm going to quote the one that comes from the Luo-speaking community in Kenya. It says that alone, a youth run fast, with an elder, slow, but together they go far. Of course, this proverb does appear in several ways in different languages across the globe. And one of the most common English versions of it is, if you want to go alone, go fast, you should go alone. But if you want to go far, you should try to go with others. Of course, this proverb seems to speak a very universal truth, and there's so much more that we can do when we work together in partnerships. But of course, this is easier said than done, because when you think about partnerships and what it takes to both initiate, nurture, and make sure that a partnership is successful for the change that you hope for, there's a lot to overcome before we can get to do that. Of course, you can think of the logistics in terms of time, resources, both human resources and financial resources, and even the patience it takes to achieve the ultimate outcome that you hope for, because results don't come immediately as we would hope. So generating ideas and then making sure that those ideas get into policy and the actions that are needed to ensure that the ultimate outcome is achieved. This is a long process. And the question is, how patient can we be in the process of creating the change that we hope for? And of course, when you then put on top of this the timelines and requirements of funders, especially funders who provide project grants with specific time-bound deliverables, the barriers gets even higher. And so even though it is easy to see the value of partnerships, when you think about the efforts it will take to build these partnerships, can be enormous. And because these barriers can be very high, sometimes we are tempted to take the shortest possible route, or maybe take the path of least resistance. And sometimes that path means that going it alone, because the effort involved in just bringing other people on board can be tasking. And if you have to meet donor requirements in the shortest possible time, then of course, building partnerships can be undermined by some of those requirements. But this is why I must commend the organizers of this year's conference, because I do think that focusing on this particular thorny issue of partnerships and figuring out how we can work together collectively to ensure we deliver on the outcomes we hope for would be useful. But of course, the beginning is try to identify some of the key bottlenecks, how we will address them, and how we will do that going forward. So what I'm going to do is to speak to a few practical examples of successful partnerships that I've been involved in. But before I do that, as I said, I want to take a step back and reflect on some of the overarching logic behind partnerships. I'll try to outline some of the triggers for partnerships that I've experienced in my work, and then also to identify some key ingredients about partnerships as we move into dive deeper into some of the key or some of the practical partnerships that we have engaged in, to identify some of the key ingredients we should be aware of when we're getting into this space. So talking about the world of think tanks. Of course, think tanks, or think and do tanks as some people like to call them. We are in the business of ideas and change. And this is just to paraphrase what Andrea said at the beginning. Unlike academic researchers, think tankers do not have the luxury to just stop at ideas creation. Of course, probably that is the easier part for think tanks, because we have expert researchers who can generate the evidence, generate the knowledge. But then getting those ideas into policy processes is where the challenge lies. And that is why partnerships become very essential in this business. In this world that is increasingly characterized by pressing and sometimes very punishing problems, of course, extreme poverty, inequality, climate change, infectious diseases, violent extremism, we have rapid decline in the values and practice of democracy. Good ideas from think tanks like yourselves and other partners are extremely important and critical to addressing these problems. But while the production of relevant knowledge may come easily to some of us in this virtual room, I know that, of course, you all know bringing those ideas into policy processes can be difficult. In a book by John Kingdon titled Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policy, he notes that, and I quote, being heard in the public policy process is often more about being positioned to take advantage of opportunities as they arise than it is doing a set of things that is fully under one's control. And I believe we can all relate to this statement, because we can have full control of knowledge production, ideas generation, but then when it does come to bringing those ideas into policy processes, we know that it is an iterative process that includes discovery, learning, adaptation, and of course, they do require resources, expertise, networking, persistence, and perhaps the most important one being good timing. All right, so the fact that partnerships, collaborations, or coalitions, or however you want to characterize it, that these things matter for sustainable change is certainly not a big question. We all know it is valuable. But what are the factors that might trigger a need to partner with others? And as we begin to think about deep dives, whether we're having partnerships with the private sector, partnerships with governments, or people in government, or reformers in government, the question is, what are the things that might trigger such a need for those partnerships? In my experience, the first key thing is ideas. That is a need to refine your own ideas or gather new ones from this to inform decisions and actions that you need to achieve the outcome that you hope for. And of course, this is the key reasons why think tanks exist anyway. In this particular case, one might consider partnerships that are built around peer learning. As a think tank or research institution, you may be able to generate ideas internally. But being human as we are, sometimes those ideas may be influenced by our own unconscious biases. And so if you have the opportunity to engage with others and your peers and other relevant actors, subjecting your ideas to debate and critique, that can potentially help to sanitize them and position you to be in a position to succeed in your adventure. Otherwise, sometimes if your ideas are not scrutinized and giving the critics that you may not be aware of, you may hit a snag once you start to push it forward into the policy process. So engaging with peers, engaging with partners, subjecting your ideas to debates can be super helpful. And it can serve as a trigger for wanting to start a partnership. The second trigger that I've come across is credibility. And I say this because sometimes it is necessary, even if you have excellent, uncontroversial ideas that could be used in policy decisions. If you don't have credibility in the eyes of the audience or the policymakers you hope to bring the ideas to, your ideas may not go far. So in this particular case, building a diverse partnership or network of independent and credible institutions to come together to stand behind a particular idea that you're trying to advance could create a better opportunity for success. Because in that case, the credibility of the evidence can then be positioned within the institutions that have coalesced together around a particular issue. Just by way of example, the Coalition of Domestic Election Observers, there's a group in Ghana, in my home country, Ghana, called the Coalition of Domestic Election Observers. And this group was formed by a wide cross-section of actors from the Ghanaian society, including professional associations, religious groups, student unions, trade unions, think tanks, and the like. And all of these groups came together because they had one purpose: to make sure that the quality and credibility of Ghanaian national elections are intact. And because of the composition of this group, it gained a great deal of credibility across the political divide. And as a result of it, the coalition has become a very influential player in Ghanaian elections, and their reports and recommendations are often taken very seriously by the key stakeholders. So for this group, the main trigger for coming together as a coalition was to create a sense of credibility of the group to make sure that they can deliver on the particular purpose that they are set up for. The third trigger that I've come across is momentum building. So sometimes some issues require that you build momentum in order to gain traction. And this may involve having partnerships from several key players and acting collectively around the issue. So for example, you may want to tap into existing networks, engage in the media, partnering with political parties, sometimes actually partnering with funders, because some funders or donors may have the convening power in government or among decision makers that you want to leverage on, or working closely with reformers in government, social movements, social media influencers, and the like, in order to create awareness and bring greater visibility to a particular issue or cause that you are trying to drive forward. And I'm actually keenly interested in hearing from some of you about the use of social media influencers, because these are becoming increasingly key actors in this space, and thinking of ways to leverage their talent to deliver on some of the issues that think tanks work on, I think could be very innovative and interesting. The fourth and final trigger that I've come across is access to decision makers. Of course, whatever we do as think tankers, as researchers, the ultimate determinant of success is the ability to actually get the information or the ideas into the right hands. And so access to decision makers could take many forms depending on the issue and the context. It may involve pursuing partnerships with reformers that are closest to the decision makers. Sometimes it might require that you embed researchers or second some researchers from your institution into strategic public institutions. Sometimes it might require that you work with donors who may have an influence on the key decision makers in the process. And so access to decision makers could also inform the need for building a partnership. But let me note here that these partnerships or triggers that I've mentioned, all four of them, these are not mutually exclusive. In fact, very often, sometimes they are all deployed at once. You may want to generate ideas, make sure they put that together a coalition that has credibility. And as a result of pulling together a diverse coalition, you create momentum for it. And in the process, you may be able to gain access then to decision makers. And so just as we think about partnerships, some of these key elements might be necessary to then think about how you constitute the particular partnership in order to deliver on the agenda. Right, and so I've been talking about the triggers that I have come across in terms of forming partnerships. Let me move away from that and then ask the question, but what are the key features of a partnership? What would make for a good partnership? And here again, I'm going to highlight three key things that I've come across in my own experience. The first critical step is clarity of purpose. That is, what the partnership is for. Of course, a partnership will be meaningless if you don't really have a clearly defined purpose. And if you have a clear and compelling purpose, it makes it easier to identify who the relevant actors are, what groups to bring on board, and of course, it does keep the groups actually focused and accountable to their particular mission or vision that they are hoping for. And as I mentioned earlier on, for example, the Coalition of Domestic Election Observers in Ghana, their key purpose, as defined in their records, is to enhance the quality and credibility of national elections. And because this is so clearly defined, actors that see this as something that aligns with their own values and aspirations are easily swayed into joining. And of course, once you come on board, you all know that this is what you're working towards, and that's how to guide the types of activities that you actually undertake. The second feature that I've seen is complementarity. Right. Partnerships are most effective when partners complement each other. Of course, you don't want to build a partnership where everybody is doing the same thing. You really want people who would come in and complement your efforts. And so partnerships that are composed of institutions or groups with unique capabilities along the value chain of any issue that you're hoping to tackle tend to do better. And so that means that each partner, first of all, will feel valued because your contribution is essential to the entire process. And by so doing, it means that all partners will then try to do their best to ensure that they don't become the bottleneck in the process of delivering the outcome that you hope for. So complementarity is always key. Of course, if you are focused on building momentum, it may not come down to complementarity. You may just want the numbers to support an effort, but it makes more sense often to make sure that efforts by the different actors in a partnership are actually complementary. The final point, and Andrea started off by mentioning this, is equality. Of course, in this group and at this conference, we want equal treatment. We want people to be able to voice their views. And so in a partnership, it's best to treat everybody as equal partners. I would always say the quickest way to fail in a partnership is to view or treat other partners as tools or a means to your end, because then you begin to use your partners as though they are just vehicles for you to achieve your aim. Sometimes that will happen because some partners wield more power, or maybe they have exclusive control of the financial resources, and so they are able to view, they tend to view other partners as just tools for them to use. And I think that could be a recipe for disaster. And thinking about forming a partnership, all partners must be treated as equal. And I said successful partnerships must be built on equality and mutual trust and respect. Now let me turn and talk briefly about a practical example that I used as I worked in the field of philanthropy. And then as part of this example, I'm going to share a few thoughts on how we can begin to tackle some of the bottlenecks that hinder effective partnerships, and hoping that some of these ideas that are put here may be useful as we begin to have deeper dive conversations on partnerships going forward. And so a bit of history here. I spent a little over 5 years in my professional life in private philanthropy. When I started in the role, I had the responsibility of allocating up to about $10 million annually to grantee organizations around the globe. A few months into the role, and after reading several strategies of our partners, it was clear to me that some of the partnerships, especially those between international NGOs and research institutions and their local partners in Africa, could be improved through the way I make my grants. Of course, the grants or the funding was the only tool that I had control over and could do some experimentation with it. And I believe that the Hewlett Foundation, being a learning institution, was very supportive of this because they believe in experimentation, and I've always valued the Hewlett Foundation for its willingness to fund institutions on experimental basis. And sometimes you may fail, and the belief is that even in failure, you can learn a lot from it. And how did my experiment proceed? And this is what I did. I tried to focus on two things. One, removing the exclusive control of resources by one or a few of the partners. And then the second was to try to foster complementarity across the partners in that particular space that they worked in. So what I did was to make separate grants. So rather than make one grant to one institution and have them be the ones identifying partners and working with, what I did was make separate grants to some of the key partners in the particular outcome area that they worked in. And by making the separate grants, what that did was to remove the control of resources from one party and then spread it across all the parties so that each partner had absolute control over their own resources. The second thing I did was to deliberately then craft the funding such that it supported the key competences of, or the critical competences of each partner. So that if one partner I knew was very good at advocacy but not very strong in research, I made sure that I emphasized their grant on the advocacy side. And on the other side, I look at them and say if they have more strength in research, then I emphasize the research side of their programs. So what this approach did was it had two effects. It allowed each partner, as I said, to have full control over their budget. But the second thing it did was to then make sure that each partner focused on their core competences as they work together towards the ultimate goal. Of course, the key points to note here is that these partnerships already existed. And as a funder, and if there are funders in this room, of course, the key role was to find a way to make these partnerships more effective, as opposed to being the one building these partnerships, which I certainly wouldn't encourage, because building artificial partnerships wouldn't work. And especially as funders, the best role you can play is to facilitate what already exists, as opposed to trying to set up or establish a new partnership. But while funders can play a big and instrumental role, especially when it comes to resources and thinking about ways to make partnerships more effective, I think grant seekers like yourselves here, several of us here, must also should be able to play a role in making sure that we generate the needed resources to facilitate partnerships. And why do I say this? Because partnerships should not be an afterthought. And as you were challenged previously in previous conferences, if we want to deliver on bringing our ideas to policy processes, we have to be careful in making sure that we build in partnerships that are needed to deliver on the outcomes we hope for. I'll go back to John Kingdon's book, and then there's one place he states that good ideas do not drive policy change by themselves. They must be coupled with conventional political forces. We have to be very deliberate about building these conventional political forces, which are essentially partnerships, into our grant proposals. Because without reflecting them in the request for funding, then we find ourselves stuck at a point that we really want to build partnerships to make sure that we move forward with bringing our ideas into public policy. And once the resources are not there because you did not cater for them in your funding proposal, then you have no way of actually delivering on it. So as grant seekers, I would implore that we should be very deliberate about trying to understand the types of partnerships down the line that you will need to deliver on your particular objective, and make sure that you capture those as part of your funding request to ensure that you have enough funding to support them. But of course, it also comes down to funders in the space who support this work to make sure that the funding is actually made available to support and facilitate some of these engagements, which the resource requirements can be enormous, and we need to be sure that we have enough resources to do that. And I'm getting to the conclusion of my speech now. You may recall at the onset, I identified some 3 key barriers to nurturing effective partnerships. And these included resources, which I just spoke about. Of course, for resources, think tanks, researchers, or grant seekers in general can play a role in making sure that we put this in our grant proposals to get the resources we need to fund them. Funders can play a role by making sure, of course, you figure out ways you can structure grant making to ensure that you allow partnerships to thrive. The other key point barriers that I mentioned were time and patience. Making sure that you're patient enough for the results to come through, and also that you have the time to actually invest in these partnerships. But these are the 2 key considerations or constraints that I have not had the answers to, and I hope that at this conference maybe we'll begin to talk about them. So my first critical question will be, how might we make or find the time to initiate, nurture, and grow partnerships in ways that will lead to sustainable change? Time investment can be a barrier, and the question then comes down to, as much as we will talk about partnerships and the value that partnerships bring, we've got to be sure that in addition to the financial resources, the time commitment to do it can be enormous, and it can be a discouraging factor in this particular case. And so being careful about, when we talk about partnership, think about the time that you would require to build these partnerships. But of course, I don't really have the answers to that. I hope that we can discuss that in the Q&A. The second one is just the patience for results to achieve the results, because often in this particular space, in the world of think tanks, we know it can take forever for you to just achieve one particular outcome that you can pinpoint to, that you have either contributed or caused, if you're able to cause it, or you've contributed to a particular outcome. And so building the patience, the muscle to be patient enough and make sure that you sustain the partnership to deliver an outcome is super critical. But how do we do that? How do we create the room for patience? And in this particular case, can funders play a role? Because we should also remember that they also have constraints on them. And so how do we figure out how funders can support the process of building partnership, but that collectively we're all patient enough to wait for the outcomes at some point. Sometimes it may even happen not in our lifetime. So we need to think about that as carefully as we go along. But if we do think that funders can play a role, well, how will they play that role? I think that will also be something for us to consider. In any case, I don't think I have the answers to the time and patience questions. I hope that we can engage in that and talk about them. But then I would like to just end here by saying a big thank you again to the organizers on Think Tank and everybody participating here. I'm really eager to engage with you, to learn from you, your experiences.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was really interesting. I have noted a couple of questions, but we also have some questions from the audience and participants here. I wanted to first highlight, I'm going to use my moderator privileges to ask the questions first, and while we participants have a time to think what they'll want to ask Joe, or perhaps that someone wants to start helping us answer the question that Joe posed. But a couple of highlights that I got from listening to the keynote. One thing a couple of things that stood out is, so on the question of why partnerships, I think that we can start getting a first answer. It's because we can achieve more together, that we can go further together. I like the reference to alone that we go fast, but together we go far. And I think that's a good reference, and it ties up neatly what you were saying at the end about changes taking a long time. So partnerships are a way for lasting change to happen as the partnerships can build and continue building throughout time to achieve the long changes that we're all trying to get. Something that I also reflected on when you were saying about the experiment that you had with funders and giving grantees control of the resources, and that facilitated collaboration. That made me think of something, and again in the spirit of partnership with other disciplines, of a theory in psychology called the self-determination theory by a couple, Ryan and Desi, and they post that people need autonomy, relatedness, and competence to function. And I think that could apply nicely as well in partnerships. So if partners feel competent in what each can do, so we each have our strengths and our ways to, we each are good at something. So we have the media good at something, we have a social movement good at something, we have a civil society and with specific actors with each of the competences, and feeling valued in the partnership, I think, can make it strong. And I think that relates to what you were saying also on autonomy. And I think that was really good with the resources. And that also, I think, answers a bit this question of power dynamics in partnerships. And that could be, that was an interesting experience. And finally, relatedness, which is feeling connected with the other person. And the credibility that you mentioned, the patient, the connection that we each need to make for a partnership to be effective. So those were just some things that I reflected on. And there's a question from Kike here, Enrique, and I think it also relates to what you were saying about being positioned to take advantage. And sometimes that position can be the organization prepares for for this to come. But I think the position also relates to networks and the connections that you have. So in the case, if partnerships often take place between people organizations with existing relationships, so that we're positioned to already to act. But it's usually people from the same network. So you have people from the same universities, social spaces, and this can lead to somewhat exclusionary processes. So it's at the same time the strength and a hindrance. I don't know the word right now of partnership. So some individuals and some people are more prominent. So they come from the same universities, they come from the same networks, and we perpetuate the circle. I don't know if you could comment or have any thoughts on that, or maybe participants here have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think, familiarity is the thing that sometimes starts some of these networks. And of course, networks or collaborations and partnerships can be developed from individuals knowing each other from kids, maybe from high school or from university, and it sort of begins to build from there. I think that is why I mentioned that to form a partnership, you need to be clear about the purpose. Like, what exactly do you want to achieve? And if staying within your regular networks is not going to allow you to deliver on the particular objective, you may want to reconsider, because you could form a partnership that one is a party of folks who do almost the same thing, and you don't really have others who can play complementary roles to ensure that you deliver on the outcome. And so if you have a team of savvy researchers who know how to generate ideas, know how to critique each other and make sure their ideas are the top quality ideas in the world, that is great. Do you have anybody there who can move those ideas into the corridors of policymaking, or do you have to go outside of the circle to bring those people in? You could say that you can develop expertise internally, within your known networks, but I think that often it makes the case for why you need to go outside your regular networks, because then, of course, the people that you are ignoring in the process may be the ones who can actually drive the agenda. And I think when I talked about John Kingdon's book about building the political forces around these issues, we just have, because usually like-minded people go together, and you may end up being people who do similar things, but you really want to bring in diversity to ensure that you can move forward. But of course, the credibility of it, because if I know that this group of folks are all from a top university in the world, that issue of you people are out of touch and you don't have the credibility and standing to actually deliver on this can be a big hindrance to your ability to deliver on your objective. And so I'm making sure that you diversify the group so that you can have some credibility in the face of your audiences is super critical for them. So I think those considerations should inform how or why you should move outside of your known networks.
Okay. I think we can take two roads here. We can travel the road of the questioning about the credibility, or we can take the other road of questioning about how can funders, maybe with your past Hewlett hat and the question they presented, help support this? So help support that the think tankers go outside, and other actors as well, go outside their circles. And there's a commentary on the chat about making room for patients. So that's a long play. So again, and sometimes in funding models, it's very short scheme. So I don't know if you could have any thoughts on that.
Right. So in terms of thinking about connections, and funders are sometimes actually the best position to do that, because you have the bedside view in terms of just looking across the ecosystem and seeing who does what. And sometimes, because you get to read strategies, you get to read reports, and you interact with these fund actors in the space, and you know their capabilities, I can actually tell that think tank A would do better if they were to go with think tank B. So even if the think tank A are the one I know, and you partner with me and you have no knowledge of what think tank B does, I, as a funder, can see that, and I can make that recommendation, even though you don't want to be the one trying to push the networking. You can always make a recommendation. I think I've done this several times where I spot some opportunities of collaboration, and I'm like, I do see that this area that you're trying to work on, I feel like this group over here have the capabilities that can complement the work you're doing. And if you are into it, certainly I'll provide the resources to make sure that you can collaborate on that front, both providing the resources to facilitate the collaboration, but also funding the particular areas that you work in. I think, yes, funders can play a big role in providing, at least providing guidance and also advising for those connections to be made.
That's a really interesting good thought. So it is the funders who can support the grantees networking and engaging together to find these similar purposes. And while you were saying that, I also had a thought that is a great way, but maybe you also need funders to work with each other. And because if a fund has their own grantees, that's again another network. So if we also foster cross-funder collaboration, we could strengthen that as well, and we would have this networks engaging with each other. I don't know, what do you think about that? How can we support that?
So that is more like the end coming from, and of course this has happened before, where institutions, think tanks are working on different issues and they partner with different funders, and they can see the types of things that different funders support. And that is where think tanks like us can often speak to funders by telling them about the consistencies, or at least the synergies between what they fund and what your other funding partners actually fund, and thinking about ways that they can collaborate on that front. So for example, of course, if you're working in issues of, say, taxation, there are lots of funders out there who fund taxation, and there's several funders are always looking for opportunities to collaborate, whether to create a basket fund or think of other innovative ways that you can support the entire field. And so as a think tank on the receiving end of funding, because you deal with multiple funders, you may be able to see consistently who are the actors who are funding the same thing in your institution, and how might they collaborate in the process of making sure that their funding can help to move the field forward. And I think that will be more of a field building from the field building side. Like, we want to do our work, but then we want to see the field move forward. So if there's some connection. So that's where then funders can spot these opportunities. I mean, grantees can spot the opportunities and speak to their funders. The other side is what I spoke out earlier, where funders sit at the top and they can see the connections and make those connections. The same way think tanks that are on the receiving end do see some opportunities for collaboration, and hopefully can engage our funders for that.
That's an interesting thought, and that also plays a bit with the power dynamics that exist and could help in that. Let me see if there are a couple of comments or any questions on the chat. So we have a question from Alexander Nacio. What are the practical challenges that you've experienced? Then we have Jennifer. Oh, there it is. Can you see it on the screen?
Yeah, right. Okay. So when it comes to targeting marginalized communities in developing countries, how do you address that? Right. And so, of course, as has been mentioned earlier, the practice of, building these partnerships at any level is difficult, but the further local you go, the more difficult it becomes. But I think that's where tapping into existing networks can be very helpful, because if you have social movements, and of course, it also depends on the purpose. Like, what is the purpose? What are you trying to do? And if it is about building momentum for a particular issue, then of course, tapping into existing networks and thinking of engaging with the media and other actors that can bring greater visibility to the issue, that could be important to look into. Here, you talk about if you are targeting marginalized communities in developing countries. The question is, are you targeting them to make sure that their voices are heard? Are you targeting them because you want to ensure that resources actually get to them? So as I said, once you clearly define the purpose, it can be super helpful in identifying who to bring on board to make sure that you can deliver on that. If my purpose in working targeting marginalized communities is to ensure that their voices are actually heard in the process, then I can see myself building a vertical partnership where I partner with institutions that actually work closely with these marginalized communities to ensure that I'm in touch with them through that network. Because often in local communities, you will have either development NGOs and the like, and of course, even local government authorities working closely with these communities? And how do you then engage with those actors in the process of building a partnership that can achieve the objective for which you hope for? For example, making sure that their voices are heard in the policy process.
Thank you very much for that. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to ask? If not, I have a final one that is about ending partnerships. So when or why should the partnership end?
Right. Yeah. In some places, I see that Enrique talked about, patients, needing to both think about the short term, but also the long term. But should partnerships come to an end? And as I said, if this is a one-time objective. So for example, if we set up a partnership that is aimed at making sure that the next elections in Paraguay are clean, free and fair, and that is the only objective we have. Right after those elections, we are done. We are no longer going to continue. Of course, that could be the end of it. And so you have a clear objective. You have an end point of it. It comes and passes, and that is it. I mean, you may not continue to actively work together, but I think once you develop that partnership, I'm sure some discussions will continue to go on. But for many partnerships, I do think that it can become just perpetual in your business, because in the spaces that think tanks work, partnerships are so crucial that you don't really want to just completely drop a partnership. It might go dormant. You may not be actively engaged, but I think that just maintaining links with potential partners can be useful, because as it noted here, one of the most important determinants of success is good timing. And sometimes the opportunity arises when you least expect it. And that's when you really need to then galvanize your partners to make sure that you take advantage of the opportunity. If you drop it completely, that's where you then struggle to take advantage of those opportunities. And I think that may be the reason to perpetuate your partnerships, even if you're not actively working on a particular issue.
So it's about building the relationships throughout high and low times. So when time to acts come, you're ready. You have everything ready to get started. And so we're about to close the session. I wanted to thank you very much, Joe, for this. If anyone else has any other comments or questions, we'll continue on the sessions, and we'll continue to build on these questions. Thank you very much, Joe, for being here. This has been really interesting and enriching.